Ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great pleasure to welcome Okri.
Thank you very much.
The format of this particular session is not in any rigid order. We are all here to enjoy ourselves. It is a great privilege to be sitting with a great lady Okri, a writer, a poet, a thinker, an essayist, a short story writer, a wordsmith. And I am sure, I'm confident that a lot of you know more about him. He is the voice that is much needed today, a voice that defines literature in a more broader context, doesn't limit it to just the book and the Eiffel Tower. So let me introduce once again Ben Okri.
So you want to have a conversation?
No, I don't want to have a conversation. They're more interested in you than me. They hear me every day.
Yeah, but we have to have a conversation.
No, we can't have a conversation. I want them to enjoy.
I like conversation.
The hall, do you like the audience? Let's get a vote from the audience. You want to hear him, right? Yes. See, I told you, they are very familiar.
Yeah, but you have questions prepared for me.
I have questions prepared, but then I met you and then I decided these ought to go out. What we need round here, okay, I'll just give you a tickler. You, in one of your interviews, turned around and said, now since I'm a reader and most of us in this audience are readers, you turned around and said, you want people to read your book very slowly, with plenty of gaps in the reading. Very slowly. The image I get is, okay, assimilate, think, reflect, fine, but all writers want that. What makes your statement so different?
Well, first of all, I want to ask you all a question. Just put your hands up for yes or no. How many of you here are really fast readers? Okay, that's a good number. Okay, how many of you here are really slow readers? Actually, that's quite equal. I was hoping it was going to be the other way around so I could start this conversation. But the reason I asked the question is because I used to be a very fast reader when I was much younger. In fact, I prided myself on the speed of my reading. But something very curious happened to me about 20 years ago. I found that when I returned to the books that I'd read at such terrific speed, I didn't recognize them. I read those same books and I had this very strange feeling that I actually hadn't read them before. And this began a really major revolution in my thinking. I sort of came to the conclusion, after talking to a lot of people at schools and universities and ordinary readers, I came to the rather disturbing conclusion that we are probably ruined by our idea of reading. I think general education tries to give the impression that the faster you read, the more intelligent you are. I mean, I could give extreme examples like the way they talk about John F. Kennedy. Many of the things they say, one of the things they tend to focus on a lot is how fast he read. When I want to say someone is intelligent, they say he reads or she reads very fast. But I think that fast reading, while it's really very good for the brain because it forces you to sort of make connections very quickly, and also it's very exhilarating when you read fast. And also it forces your brain to act at 4 or 5 times its normal speed. But the downside of that is that we miss vast portions, many layers and dimensions of the books that we read when we read them too fast. So I began this whole process of actually slowing down my reading. And I went through this wonderful, long experiment with books to see what happened if I slow my reading down so much that I would read something like a paragraph a day. And to see what happens to the books I really love when I read them that slowly. And actually what happened was extraordinary. I began to feel more like the writer of those books when I read them slowly than when I read them fast. I actually found when you talk about reading as an immersive experience, it's actually truer when you read slowly. You actually go into the world of the text, you go into the world of the books. The world becomes elongated and infinitely richer. That too had a big impact on my writing. I mean, I always wrote to be read slowly, even when I was reading fast. But when I began to read slowly myself, my writing became even more about reading it slowly. And I can always tell reviewers who've read my books too fast. And I can tell friends who've read my books too fast. So my last 5, 6 books are written in such a way that you're to read them and leave spaces in the reading. To read a couple of sentences, maybe a paragraph, and go for a walk. My books no longer are about finishing them. They're about being in them, being still in them.
Okay.
It's a different way of writing. It's a different way of living. It's a different way of reading. I also think that we talk to one another too fast, incidentally. I think we understand too quickly. So for me, it's about just slowing down so there's more depth.
So when you talk about slowing down, I do get an idea, and I'm not going to turn around and say, oh, I get everything, but it is good advice that you have. And I'm thinking of Atwood, Margaret Atwood, her coming up, reading Tempest slowly, and I wonder how slowly she read, but she brought the hard seed out. And then I think of Jean Rice, who reads Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre and turns Rochester into a rascal, exploiting poor Bertha. So in those were the days, Margaret Atwood, contemporary. But when we reread, and which book then you felt came up with a totally new meaning? Any book that you reread, slowly read, and then realized, hold on, there's more to this book. I didn't get it the first time.
Okay, I've got to be really honest. With really bad books, when you read them slowly, they're worse.
No, you're making our life difficult.
They're not, really bad books, when you read them slowly, that's kind of like torture. So I'm not advising this. If you realize pretty quickly it's a really bad book, read it fast. Yeah? If you have to read it. Because I think sometimes there are some bad books that we have to read. It's part of our education as well. I think as writers, we shouldn't only read good books. We should also read bad books. Just like you should also watch bad films. It's important. But you actually realize the books you should read slowly, because when you read them slowly, they're doing something to you. I could give you many books. I could give you the books of Chinua Achebe's lesser known novels, like No Longer at Ease. Poetry is famous for yielding more when you read it slowly. But with poetry, one should go even deeper into the reading slowly. One should just read one line, sometimes just a few words, just to hear what's being done with the syllables. Because good poetry is not just about the lines and the rhyming, and it's also about the sounds.
So would you like to read something?
No, not at this particular point.
Not at this particular point? Okay. Your fiction, but before I move to this question, let's look at your stories. They are a different world. You draw on the European myths, but it's when you're reading it, and I'm sure my audience will share that feeling, when you're reading it, it is a mythical world, it is a world of wonder, yet it is so grounded in reality. You can read nationhood into it. You can read, they have such a universal quality. I wouldn't limit it to, let's say, just Nigeria, or it's the human question that is being asked in it. So my question is, where does the optimism come? It's chaotic. And its emergence of the animal world, it's like, to phrase it correctly, I would say both human and animal, it becomes a creatural world. The lizard becomes very important. The turtle is talking, the tortoise are talking, the snake is coming to you. There's a dialogue going on between animal, human, and yet, as a reader, not once do we feel that, look, what is he doing to us? I mean, how can an animal talk? You get caught in the mood, and then you realize that you're talking about a very tangible reality. So where does your empathy come from with the chaos that is sort of built in your novels? And at this point, I have The Famished Road in mind. I have Incident at the Shrine, short stories, Under the Bridge, they are pretty graphic, they're pretty disturbing. Yet there is something very soft about them. What makes them human? How do you make the horror human? That it gives you goosebumps.
Well, it's a very complicated question you're asking, and very complicated compliments you're giving me, for which I thank you very much. But let me break down your question. How do you make the stories human, and how do you have the chaos and the animal world and the human world and the spirit world? Well, it's such a complicated thing to tell you, because I began life as a writer, as a realist, because our education in Nigeria, you got Western realism as the first form of storytelling in writing. So you got Dickens, you got Ibsen, you got the great Russian writers, you got realism. And so when I began to write, I wrote, first of all, in the tradition of realism, which is to say, to describe the world as it appears to me. But as I got older, and as I got into conversations with my father, and as I listened to the stories of my mother, three very crucial things: getting older, father, mother. I became aware that actually realism is unsatisfactory to describe the world in which I grew up. From my mother, I got this incredible storytelling quality. I've told this many times, but if my mother wants to explain something to me, if I've done something wrong, she wouldn't say, "Ben, you've done something wrong." She would tell me a story. She would say, let's say I break a glass. She would say, "Ben, come, let me tell you a story." And she'd tell me a story, and the story usually, one, will have no connection to the glass I've broken. The story was never conclusive, and the story tended not to have a point. And she'd finish the story, or she wouldn't finish the story, and I'd be left wondering, Mom, what was that all about? What were you trying to tell me? And years would go by, and I'd keep going back to these stories that she'd tell. And as I got older, these stories yielded more and more and more. And I came to realize, because of that, a kind of a cunning form of storytelling that is part of the African mind, certainly part of my mother's mind. And I wanted to write stories like that, stories that were concluded but inconclusive, stories that seemed pointless but were enigmatic and puzzled you and bothered you, stories that didn't seem to relate to anything, but the deeper you thought about it, it related to everything. It's a very interesting elliptical form of storytelling. So that's one strand. And the other strand is my father, who I'd argue with about Plato. I'd talk to him about the Greeks. I'd tell him about Plato's world of perfect forms. I'd talk to him about Aristotle's idea of comedy. And he would look at me and he would say, you know, we have our philosophers, meaning Africa. And I'd say, really? Who? And he'd do this. So you can tell my father and my mother were people who liked making gestures and telling stories that left it all to your imagination. My father would say, this is where our philosophers are. So it's only much later when I was in England, thinking about that gesture, which was a universal gesture, a gesture that included here, there, things, space, the air, what you imagine, what you dream, the ancestors, the unborn. That became my greatest education. And then I realized that, of course, African life is a life that's lived on three or four dimensions: the dimension of the present, the dimension of the ancestors, the dimension of the unborn, dimension of spirits, and all of these dimensions happen on the same plane. They're not on different levels. They're all here. So this had a huge impact on my writing, and I spent about 10 years unpacking writing. I bought primers that they used to teach kids language from the age of 3. I bought ABC primers and retaught myself, as it were. I went right back to the basics of how things become real to us in words. And it was a 10-year process of reorganizing, redreaming myself, because I wanted all of those levels. The level of society, the level of suffering, the level of poverty, love, our humanness, our pain, our sense of humor. I wanted all of that to be there, but on the same surface. Very difficult. Because the weakness of realism is that if you want to describe different levels, you have to be sequential. You have to say, this happened, and then that's why that happened. So you have a lot of explanation, a lot of description. And it makes books longer and more complicated. But to try and make it so it's all on the surface, it happens all at once. Because when we experience life, we experience it all at once. You know, as I'm talking to you now, different images and memories and dreams and ideas are coming into your mind, but it's all at this moment. You're experiencing the complexity of being and everything. All of our levels, really immeasurable levels, but we experience it here, now, just this same plane. And that's how I wanted my books to be, to have all of those depths, but on one plane. Not easy.
Okay. That sounds, I think...
Is that a comprehensive answer?
Yes, that is a comprehensive answer. And borrowing from what you said in the morning session, and coupling it with the fact that you say that you are always pursuing newer ways of telling stories. So you added another dimension to it in the morning session by stating that we need to find a new language that cuts across these divisions, the otherness. So can you, or do you have any idea of what sort of a new language, so that many young people are sitting in the audience who I'm sure are also trying to discover a new language. So could you just talk a little about that?
Well, the first part of your statement about I'm always looking for new ways of telling stories is just part of my restlessness and my sense of the fact that the way we tell stories affects the way we see the world. And if we have seen the world in a certain way that has given rise to the effects that we no longer are happy with, then we have to find new ways of telling stories to transfigure the way we see the world, the way we see the possibilities of the world, and the way we see the truth of the world. So for me, it's a constant difficulty. It's a constant quest. I was thinking this morning about words like multiculturalism, words like diversity, words that have become so saturated with an era that they're not doing their work anymore. If you use the word, if you say in London now, oh, I think there should be more diversity in politics, most politicians will just simply fall asleep because they've heard that word to death. The same thing with multiculturalism. Those words are exhausted. So it's renewing, it's how to renew words so that we say these truths that need to be said, but not in a way that makes us think we've heard those truths before. That's the difficulty of writing and of writers in this era particularly. Because I think the challenge we face as writers and as human beings is raised really high by the presence of people like Trump and by events like Brexit and the spread of the right wing throughout Europe, which will have an impact on all of the world. It will have an impact on the Middle East. It will have an impact on Pakistan, on Nigeria, all over the world. We're all going to be affected by this new dangerous discourse. And the thing is that they have found a new language to speak to people, to energize them in the wrong and the less than human way. They have found a new language. Listen to Trump when he gives his election talks, when he goes to talk to the people in the South. Listen to his language. The people respond to his language. They get it. There's a link. They get it. He has found a new language to speak to them. We have to find a new language, not only to speak to people who are sympathetic to us, but to speak to all people, to touch their humanity again. And that's what I mean. It's not enough to just say, this is what I want to say, there should be more fairness in the world, it's not enough to do that anymore. We have to think more deeply. We have to work a little harder at refining our language, at making it clearer and sharper and truer. That's what I mean.
The new language, yes. And this reminds me of the time, the breakdown of the world earlier, when writers like Beckett, the new writers that emerged, felt that words had been abused, had been raped. And as a result, they had to think out their words carefully. And the construct of their written work then became scantier and scantier. Your generation writers, we do have them writing, incorporating magic realism, mythology, realism, but you have been coined, and I don't mean it as an accusation, but your has been termed as fictive philosophy. A new philosophy.
Sounds very complicated. Fictive philosophy.
It's a philosophy that through the world of fiction, through storytelling, and that if I sort of think and pause and give it time and let it assimilate in me, I feel that is what a book ought to do. It ought to make you think. And you can't have the old philosophers who are, they're so due apologies, let's be true. When you ask your student to read a philosopher, it is so pithy that it sort of resists approach. But you, through your storytelling, are promoting a philosophy of seeing the world with newer eyes. In my view, and which is not the world view, or which is just a limited personal view, when I read your book, when I read a story from Incidents at the Shrine, or any piece of work, the very fact that there is a liminal space that as a reader I'm able to cross over into that other abstract reality, and then feel that yes, there's nothing unreal about it. It is as tangible as the world that I am living in. So could you just share, or let me say, I'm not asking for with reference to your writing, but I would just like to look at the philosophy that is inherent in your work. And that philosophy I find even in your poetry. The Abuku child, who is born again and again, and in the famished road, in spite of all the trouble, in spite of the pull from his companion, spiritual companion, wants to be born because he can't get over the image of his suffering mother. So, what is the philosophy? Would you like to say something?
I don't know that writers should talk about their philosophy. I think I'd like to talk about some ideas that I have. Mm-hmm. But before I do that, I was saying earlier about finding a new language. I think part of also finding a new language is also finding a new way of telling stories, and new stories. And the thing about story, let's talk about storytelling for a minute. The very curious thing about story is the way in which it empowers our humanity. Really good stories super empower our humanity. It does its work through the imagination primarily, but actually it's the way in which it gives us the power to see that which we alone are seeing. Because you have to understand that when I write a story, if you read the story of any writer, you are not seeing the world that they are seeing. You are not reading the writer's world, you're reading your world. You're reading the world that you create, that you make out of the strength or the laziness of your imagination, your empathy, your heart, as it were. And I'm fascinated by this aspect of what reading does. This way in which it expands our inner universe. Because I had this extraordinary discovery recently where I went to prison. I wasn't put in prison. I went to visit prisoners. And made an amazing discovery that actually 50% of prisoners in London, at any rate, are illiterate and can't read. And that's why they're there. And I spoke to some prisoners who were just learning to read for the first time. Now, unless you can get hold of a child, to actually find many adults who actually are learning to read for the first time is quite a fascinating experiment. And to ask them, what's happening in your mind when you read this sentence that you could not read before? Some of them could not read a word like school before. Now they can. So I said, what's happening in your mind when you read the word school? And what do they see? They see a room, like the room in prison where people are sitting around together and someone is telling them something. They build school from the environment that they know. So they make whatever they read entirely personal and expand that universe with reading. So for the writer interested in what words can do to the insides of us, for me it's a very, very important journey, very, very important art to discover. So to answer your question, where does my optimism come from? It comes from this essential fact that words, the right words, in the best order, illuminate our hearts. Yeah. Um, and the other thing that it does is that these words, we are able to imagine from them something that is entirely our own creation. So to read is to create. You are a creator when you read. You're not just a passive reader. Now, the idea that you create while you read also seems to me to suggest that the right kind of book can make people feel that they can create a world, not only here, but also out there. I think it's the courage to see how the world can be different that we need more than anything else. You know, I really want to talk about this a little bit because our education encourages us to see the world as it is, as it appears to be. Our education tells us that the world that we're seeing is the only way it can be. The architecture of this hall, we look at it and we say, well, this is the way it is, and this is the only way it can be. But I think real power comes to us as human beings when we can look at the world and see how it can be different. How this could be in the shape of a pyramid, or how it can be in the shape of a circle, a giant circle, a geodesic dome that we're sitting in. This capacity to make the world elastic to our spirit, I think, is, for me, at the heart of the new politics.
Now, I would like you...
You want to read?
No, you're going to read. As I said earlier, they're all here for you. So, the new book, it is The Magic Lamp, Dreams of Our Age. Oh, you have your copy. I have mine. So, I'm sure the audience would love to hear.
Well, before I read from it, let me talk to you a little bit about it. It's
About how the book came?
Yeah, about how the book came about. It's a book of... I've got this friend who's a painter because I'm fascinated by paintings. And when I was a kid, there were four things I wanted to be. I wanted to be a composer, a musician. I wanted to be a pirate. I wanted to be a painter, and I wanted to be a scientist. I did not want to be a writer when I was a kid. I need to stress that. The first was scientist, then pirate, then composer, then painter. And I studied the sciences. I studied science when I went to school, and painted a lot as a kid, and played the guitar very badly, and never got around to being a pirate except in my mind. But my love of painting and my relationship with painting and with art continues and is very intense, and it informs my writing. And I have a great friend called Rosemary Clooney, whose painting I know very well, and I asked her once if I could take a painting of hers and live with it. Because it goes with what I was saying earlier about reading slowly. I also like looking slowly. I like looking at one thing for a long time, because I think that the longer you look, sometimes the less you see. And after you see less, you see more. My mother would approve of that paradox, by the way. So I'd take a painting of hers and I'd put it somewhere awkward, not somewhere central where I'd see it all the time. I'd put it in a corner where I don't expect to see it, but where every time I walk past, I'd see it indirectly. And after a while, I just found that I began to write stories out of them. And in that way, I wrote these stories out of 25 paintings, and it took me 5 years. I'd write a story and I'd put it in a box, and I'd write another one and put it in a box. And 5 years went past, and one day I looked at the box, and the box was full. And I said to myself when I looked at this box, I said, my God, this is how people get rich. You just keep putting things in a box. And I rewrote the book, and it became this book. So in a sense, this is my first unintentional book. I like unintentional books, and I intend to write some more. The trouble with intentional books is that your intention comes through. And the thing about unintentional books is all the things you did not intend, all the unexpected aspects of yourself, all the things in the world that you didn't even know that you were noticing, they leak in. I like the idea of things leaking into what you're doing without you being aware of it. So that's this book called The Magic Lamp. And I would like to read shall I read a story or just read some paragraphs?
Story, everybody says story.
You want a whole story?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm going to read, they're very short, most of these stories. Let's see if I can, is this working? Yeah. I shouldn't be going fast because I like you to see it slowly. The image is not correct there because the screen is a bit elongated. But then I come from a tradition where we like elongation. If you look at a lot of African art, we like elongating things. I like elongating stories. This is a painting called Life is a Street Corner. I gave the titles to many of these paintings. And if you see it clearly, you see that it's a street, but the street's also a face. She likes this bringing together of difference. A face is where a road meets. One road cannot make a city. It takes many roads to make life a fiesta. A face is where rivers meet. It is where times meet. Each person is a marketplace. On days when there is a hint of rainbows in all things, do you not sense that buildings that have sustained our gaze begin to look like us? Through those invisible greens and purples in the air, we look upon some facade and we see our faces there. Cities are portraits of the mind. That portrait is best where a touch of silence surrounds the figure. On a building where three streets meet, a delicate face is discerned. This face is made of all that dreaming, all that suffering, beauty squeezed from time. Life is a minaret. Life is a crowded square, a stock exchange, the winding shores of a river. Life is also eloquent in the pastel of a street corner where silence meets destiny. Thank you. Should we talk a bit while I find another one?
Okay. And while you're talking about this, the life, the river, the road, I'm reminded of Hamish Road's opening lines, where you talk about the beginning of the world. And it seems that your writing is like a journey to self-discovery. And that journey since self can never be discovered. It's an ongoing journey. So would you agree with me that even now, you are still fascinated with these metaphors that you have explored and will continue exploring?
You know, if we're really honest, I think if we're really, really honest, And it's very difficult to be really, really honest. But if we're really, really, really honest, I think you find that writers really explore just really a handful of images. We write many books, but it's just a handful of images that we're going back to again and again and again. Sometimes from many different angles, sometimes at different ways of hearing, at different tones, different registers. I didn't used to think this. When I was much younger, I used to think that every writer can be infinite. They can be anything. They can be anybody. But my years of reading and rereading Shakespeare, the Shakespeare of Titus Andronicus, an early play, is the same Shakespeare of The Tempest. It's the same images, few images that keeps running through his work. The same is true of Tolstoy with his long novels, few images. Dostoevsky, few images. Ibsen, the same thing. And that makes sense to me because I think each person has a unique angle on the world. We came into this world anyway at a unique angle. Ask our mothers. And every single person is absolutely unique in how they feel about the world. Everyone is unique in their dreams. Everyone's deeper selves is totally unique to them. We're like a prism, and we look out through the world through few windows out of which our soul wakens. I don't think it's the infinity of images that's important. I think what's really important is the one image, the one story, the one thing that we create just right so that it's actually able to reach and speak to everybody's unique inner world. It's a kind of geometry between writer and reader. So when I was much younger, I had this idea of the infinity of writers. And I found with each new book that I wrote that I wanted to be different. I wanted each book to be different and wrote each book differently. The more different they were, the more I was there. The more I found that I was inescapable. I couldn't escape myself. So now I don't try.
Read. You found your pen?
Yeah. I'll read another story. Do you sense what I'm saying about one or two images? Does anybody here feel what I'm saying? Okay. Can one person just tell me why they feel that? Give me an example from yourself.
You want the mic to speak?
Yeah.
Who would like?
Do you want to? Does anybody want to say? Okay, the lady over there. Oh, you've gone past the lady. It's the lady right behind you. Let's not be unjust here. Yes.
Hi. So I feel that there are few times in your life where you influence greatly, and I think you keep repeating different aspects of the same experience. I felt this strongly in there's a writer Kazuo Ishiguro.
Yes.
Yes, his work, and when you read his work, you can interpret it in different ways, but all his stories have the same theme. They are all centered around how people who are who seemingly are not very significant in the social life, their stories and what they feel, and yes, and then there's Imtiaz Ali's work. In all his directorial work, he's a filmmaker from India. In all his works, it's the same thing. It keeps repeating itself.
But it's not really a repeating.
It's not.
Yeah,
It's actually
it's not a
different.
repeating.
It's
Yeah.
a different, as you said, you look at it in different angles.
Yeah, it's the inevitability of the self.
Exactly.
Yeah, yeah. Anybody else? It's the lady at the front.
Hello.
Yes.
I think where I feel, and I don't necessarily agree with Shakespeare, because I just see so many images and stories in that particular Shakespeare. But there are, I think maybe this would, there is violence in every image that I see, whether it is in Shakespeare or it is in your poetry or it is in Neruda or it is in, and there is love, there is connect, and there is despair, and there is optimism, and there is, I think, even when I'm not a writer, but if ever I attempt to write or when I speak, that violence, which is the violence that gave birth to my child, which is the violence that gave birth to me, but also the same connect and love and optimism, it's melded, it's welded together. And it's, I think that is the one story I experience over and over again.
Okay.
And I wanted to say that your poetry speaks not just my truth, but I teach drama, a lot of my students, it speaks their truth. And across borders and across lives, there's specifically 2 poems that my students keep coming back to, so I wanted to let you know that.
I like the idea of your son sitting right at your feet. Yeah. Shall I read one more story?
Yes. And then a poem.
It's very hard to know what stories to read. Okay, I'm going to read this one called Walking the Fish. That's called Those Enchanted Songs. That's called Walking the Fish. This is a playful story. It's a whimsical story. It is common to take a dog for a walk. It is less common to take a dream for a walk. I should stop there, shouldn't I? To set out with the rising sun and an empty mind and wander the narrow path that leads to the sea. To find rising in the mind a dream one had but didn't remember at the time. To ponder the dream and relive its mysterious hints. To find walking beside one like a pet unicorn, the vision of a happy future. This fills the world with rich colors. Walking with a dream works wonders on the malleable forms of the world. Obstacles bend into the shapes of one's hopes. Difficulties refigure themselves into triumphs. One's cross becomes a leaping place to the stars. The blues and reds and yellows turn into tangible currencies of fortune. One plucks gifts from the air. The tree of thorns becomes that tree of the Hesperides bearing golden fruit. Lucky are those who walk with gods. Only strong dreamers shape the magic that makes all things real. But how strange it is on a morning when the air disperses colors like birds in flight to find a woman wandering along the shore, walking her fish. She is curved like music from an Aeolian harp. The air bears the sea blues and the dazzling gold of her dress in an aquamarine dream. In truth, she was not walking her fish. The fish was taking the lady for a walk. She was in a philosophical mood that morning. Not so the fish, who preferred the silence of colors. "What are things made of?" asked the lady. "Things are made of the way you see," said the fish. "What is it that makes the way you see?" "The way you are makes the way you see." "What makes the way you are?" "Sometimes," said the fish, "it's the way you feel." "And what makes how you feel?" "The spirit," said the fish testily, "whether it be open or closed, narrow or wide, whether it flows like the sea or is frozen like ice." "But what makes the spirit?" the woman asked. "That's enough philosophy for a morning's walk," said the fish. It might have happened in a parable. It might have happened in a missing gospel of women. The miracle then would not be the multiplication of loaves and fishes. The miracle would be our conversion into the mysteries of the sea. Thank you.
Well, we set out to enjoy ourselves, and I'm sure the audience is enjoying. But let's look at a few questions more. Would you?
Yes, unless you want to give them some questions.
You want the audience? Okay. Can we have the mic? Yeah.
Hi. I was wondering if you would tell us one of the stories that your mother narrated to you and the context in which, it was presented to you. Thank you.
I was hoping somebody wouldn't ask that question.
It's really up to you, but we would...
Well, I would like to. The thing is that, the stories my mother told me, they're my Da Vinci Code. But it's true. If I start to give away those stories, I'll be giving away some of my biggest secrets. Because I'm constantly going back to and working some of those stories. But I tell you what I'll do, because I don't want to sound mean-minded. I'll tell you one story that she told me that I think is very relevant to the times in which we find ourselves. And it's a story that I tell when I tell it a lot in England when I want people to just be aware that something is happening that we're not properly conscious of. So my mother tells me this story. She says, "Ben, I don't know why, but one day," this is after I've maybe lost something or gone on an errand and I hadn't finished the errand. She said, "Ben, one day, I don't know why," and she'd pause. She always paused. "I don't know why," and I'd be like, frog jumped into this frying pan," and she brings out this frying pan. And I can see the frying pan, and I can't see a frog in it. But the minute she says, "One day, I don't know why," and she pauses, a frog jumped into a frying pan, and she brings the frying pan. The minute she brings the frying pan, you notice I've said that story twice. The minute she brings the frying pan, I see a frog jump into the frying pan. even though there's no frog in the frying pan. Yeah? A frog jumped into the frying pan. I see the frog in the frying pan. And there's water in the frying pan. And it's an empty frying pan, but I see water in the frying pan. And the frying pan is over a fire. And she's holding it in the air, but I see a fire underneath the frying pan. And then she says, but you know, the fire wasn't very big at the beginning. It was a very small fire. And I saw a big fire, and then I diminish the fire. I make it smaller. And the water in the frying pan was very cold at the beginning, so the frog was happy to be there. And very slowly, the fire got bigger, but very, very slowly. And the water in the frying pan, very, very slowly, got imperceptibly hotter. But the frog didn't realize it, because from 1 second to another, the temperature of the water felt like the same. And that's how the frog got cooked to death, she says. A very violent, horrible story, which I never forgot. And wait, and that's what's happened to us in many parts of the world. The NHS in London, in England, the National Health Service is the frog in the frying pan. It is. Many of our rights as citizens, our right to express ourselves in the climate in which we find ourselves, is a frog in the frying pan. Slowly, imperceptibly, we are being diminished. We are being killed. We are being turned inward. We're being made mute. We're being made unwilling and unable to speak. We're having our voices slowly taken away from us. But nobody's taking it away. It's just the atmosphere, the environment is slowly shifting underneath us. And the dialogue is slowly changing into something else. It's what I was trying to express today. We're perfectly good people that you used to like and know very well, who believed in freedom, slowly start to say, what are all these immigrants doing here? They're good friends of yours. They slowly start to say, why do we have to give money to people who are, and so on and so forth. These are frogs in the frying pan. Our rights, our freedom, our horizon, slowly diminishing, slowly brought closer. That's how it happens to us, bit by bit. It changes. One day we think we're in one place, we wake up 5 years later, and we're very close to a fascism that we don't even want to give a name. So I tell this, Mom tells me this story, and it's a horrible story. And there's only one antidote to this story, which is very profound awareness of the temperature of our times. You know, we don't want to be like this frog who we're comfortable where we are. We like the life that we seem to have, and slowly we're being cooked. That's how they do it to us. That's how they do it to us as individuals. They slowly cook us, and then we're dead, alive, as Ibsen would say. And sometimes we need writers and activists who will just simply get up and shout and say, we are being cooked. Get out of this frying pan. Protest about this heat. We're being cooked to death.
I'm sure. Thank you, Ben Okri. I like to end borrowing his words. They change the world best who change the way people think. And I think this is what a storyteller does. He makes the people think. So on this part,
thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.